All right, here we are for another AP Biology video. It's been a while since I said that. We're just coming back from break. Welcome to the second semester. Hopefully, you still remember some things from the first semester because second semester is going to build on that. You might have noticed that last semester we talked a lot about cells. In particular, how does a cell work? We first talked about how the cells develop with the development of cell membranes. We need energy to keep our cells running. So we talked about photosynthesis and respiration. And of course, we need proteins in order to carry out all these different functions that cells need to carry out. And so we ended talking about protein synthesis. Now, by the end of that, we should know basically how a cell can survive. Now, we're going to still be talking about cells, but this will start to branch out into the more cellular, multicellular organism area. We'll talk more about animals and organisms as a whole. But first, a question that's been split into two questions, but it's still the same question. Why would cells need to communicate? Why would two single-celled individuals want to talk to other single-celled individuals? Why would cells inside of a multicellular organism want to talk to the other cells within that same organism, right? What do you think? Now, of course, I don't know what you just wrote, but all the examples you gave would probably fit into one of these two categories, which would be cooperation and coordination. In most cases, believe it or not, working together is better than working alone. And of course, a multicellular organism is a giant coordination and cooperation between cells. So that on itself should prove the point that you can do more by working together than you can alone. But of course, there's tons of different examples, and we'll go through some of them in this video, and we'll come up with some as we go along. But they're all going to fit into this category, one of those categories. Now, to start with, an example from a multicellular organism such as yourself. Let's say you're out enjoying nature. You're out on a walk. You can't go to the movies. You can't go indoors. You can go outdoors and enjoy Mother Nature. But suddenly there's danger. Hopefully not a mountain lion. Hopefully something less deadly, but still scary, like a snake or a big spider, or I don't know what you're afraid of, a mean-looking duck. But something is really going to freak you out, right? How is your body going to respond to that danger? And I don't mean what are you going to do? I mean, how is your body going to respond? What is going to happen to your body to enable you to do the thing that you want to do? Now, I don't know what you said again, but what's going to happen is the fight or flight response. Although this is actually not the best example here. It's been now updated to be the fight, flight, or freeze response, because you shouldn't fight the mountain lion. You shouldn't run from the mountain lion. You shouldn't freeze from the mountain lion, but maybe staying still is your best option in this case. But your body is going to be prepared for danger, right? And so a whole host of things are going to happen to your body in that instant. Your heart starts to beat faster, you start breathing quicker, and this is so that you can deliver glucose to your muscles, right? Because you are about to fight or run for your life. And you're going to need to fight harder or run faster than you've ever run before. So you need glucose and oxygen so that you can get a ton of energy. Now, you're going to increase your heart rate, and you're going to open up your blood vessels so that you can move that blood faster and get it to all your muscles as quickly as possible, right? Because you're about to run as fast as you can. Again, don't run from mountain lions. Cats like to chase things. But your body is going to have a whole sweating is going to be part of this, because you're going to generate a ton of heat because of all the glucose that you're burning. Shaking, I have found, happens after the event, right? Because you still have all this glucose floating through your body, and you have all this energy that you don't need to use anymore, and so you're just standing there kind of shaking, right? You do tend to have a loss of hearing and tunnel vision. This is so that you can focus specifically on the danger, right? Dilation of your pupils means that the pupils will get bigger so that you can get more light to come in so that you can see better, right? All of this is a coordinated response so that you can hopefully survive the dangerous encounter that you're about to have, right? And so the fight or flight response is a great example of cell communication. You see the danger, you send this signal, you communicate from your eyes to your brain, and your brain communicates to your adrenal gland as well as your muscles. And your adrenal gland is going to release a hormone called epinephrine. Maybe you already said adrenaline. Adrenaline is a kind of generic term for a bunch of different chemicals. Epinephrine is the main one of them. That is usually what people are thinking of when they think of adrenaline, is epinephrine. And so epinephrine is one of the key examples that we're going to talk about in this unit. Now, all of the examples are going to follow the same basic patterns. There's either going to be, it's going to be a chemical signal of some kind, either a signal that is floating around that might have come from other cells, sometimes it comes from the environment, or a molecule that is connected to the membrane and stuck on the membrane, right? Two different ways that it could occur, but there's always got to be a chemical signal. Now, the chemical signal is going to be received by a protein receptor somewhere in or on that cell that is going to receive the signal. The signal is going to be transduced through a series of proteins that are each going to have their own little jobs, like a relay race. They are called relay molecules. And at some point, that signal is going to be relayed to the final process. Whatever needs to happen is going to happen, a response of some kind. There's a few different examples of that that we'll see as we go along, but it's always going to follow this this pattern: reception, transduction, and response. Now, lastly, there's two main categories that we would define this as, would be local or long distance communication. Now, the fight or flight response illustrates both of them, so we'll keep talking about this one, right? So the first part of the fight or flight is that the light that bounces off the mountain lion hits your eyes, and then that triggers a neuron, a brain, in this case an eye cell, but a nervous system cell. And this is going to then carry that information to your brain, right? Now, when this neuron, when this cell talks to this cell, we need cell communication. The end of a neuron right here is called an axon. And the axon leads to this gap. This gap is called a synapse. You don't need to know these words, but the synapse is the gap between two neurons. The first neuron is going to release chemicals. Those neurotransmitters, is what they're called, are going to diffuse across the gap, and they're going to trigger the next neuron to do something. Now, if we were to zoom in right here on that part of the neuron that's accepting the signal, we would see a receptor protein. And that receptor protein would then be connected to a bunch of relay molecules that would then carry that signal further into the cell until the cell did something. It responded. In this case, this cell is going to release more neurotransmitters to tell the next cell what to do, right? And so neurons need to communicate with each other to coordinate your thoughts and your emotions. There are a whole bunch of neurotransmitters. Acetylcholine is an excitatory neurotransmitter. Usually it is released to make your muscles contract. Dopamine and serotonin are both related to cognition, to your thoughts. You can see dopamine very simply, it's way more complicated than this, is for motivation. Anything that gives you pleasure, like eating, winning a race, succeeding at anything, having sex. These things make you feel good, and dopamine is the chemical that is making you feel good. The idea behind that is that once you feel that good sensation, you would like to do that again and eat more of that thing, or win more races, or have more sex. For animals, this is the motivation behind most of their behaviors, right? Animals can't think the way that humans can and like plan things out. They continue eating, not because they know that they have to eat, but because they are motivated by the pleasurable signals from when they eat. Serotonin, as you can see, is involved in a lot of things, as is dopamine, but the ultra simplified version of that is serotonin is responsible for the feelings of happiness, your mood, right? Pleasure and happiness are not exactly the same things. And a lot of antidepressants work by affecting the levels of serotonin. That the idea would be that if you're depressed, it's because you have a low level of serotonin possibly. And if you could boost that, maybe you would not be depressed. The crazy part about that is that the brain is super complicated, and that in some people, if you give them extra serotonin, it makes them more depressed, not less depressed, which doesn't make any sense, but that's because we don't really know how the brain works that well. GABA is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. It makes the next cell not send a signal. It stops the signal from being sent, and so it slows down your thoughts or the whatever's happening. Right now, that means that neurotransmitters are the weak point of the nervous system. The way they communicate can be co-opted. It can be mimicked by certain molecules, or if you could mess with the levels of the neurotransmitters themselves, then you can make cause problems inside of the animal. In particular, things like caffeine mimic acetylcholine. Caffeine makes the neurons and other cells excited, and it makes you feel like you have energy. It doesn't actually give you energy. It just makes you think that you have energy. It's kind of a mind over matter thing there. Alcohol mimics the activity of GABA. Alcohol makes your brain slower. Even though it doesn't feel that way, it is making your brain go slower. This molecule, or this example, would be from snake venom, that there is an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, a long name for an enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine. When your body wants your muscles to move, your brain sends the signal, releases acetylcholine to the appropriate muscles. The neurotransmitter makes the muscles contract. But if you want to make your muscles relax, you have to get rid of the signal. And so this enzyme gets rid of the signal so that you can relax and then maybe contract your muscle again instantaneously after. But if you're a snake and you don't want your little mouse buddy to move around while you are swallowing it without chewing, then you need it to not be able to move its muscles. So the snake venom has this molecule, which will be a competitive inhibitor of the enzyme. The mouse's muscles will not be able to relax, and it will be frozen and paralyzed so that the snake can eat it, right? And so that's one way that cell communication happens, and one way you can use it to mess things up inside of an organism. Now, that would be sending the signal to the brain. The brain then needs to send the signal out to your adrenal gland so that you can release the epinephrine, right? So here's still more local signaling. This time, the end of the axon doesn't connect to another neuron. It connects to a cell in the adrenal gland. The adrenal cell will receive the signal. It will transduce the signal, and then it will respond, this time by releasing epinephrine into the bloodstream, right? That's the response there. Now we're on to long-distance signaling. Of course, this is mostly just for multicellular organisms, especially ones that have like a circulatory system and things like that. But that hormone is going to go everywhere. Everywhere that the blood goes, that epinephrine will also go. And so this is how you can get your whole body to respond to that one thing that's happening. In your muscle cells in particular, the muscle cells need to get some energy. And so on the muscle cells, the epinephrine will connect to the receptor, which will then carry the signal further into the cell so that the response can happen. The response, in this case, is to start to break down glycogen into glucose. This is done by an enzyme called glycogen phosphorylase, right? So the signal is going to turn on an enzyme that's going to do a thing, right? It's going to take the glycogen and turn it into glucose so that you can immediately burn that glucose so that you can run as fast as you've ever run before, right? And so another example again of cell communication follows the same pathway. Now, let's think about this for a minute. What if I took some epinephrine? What if I took the signal molecule and, what am I doing here? There we go. The signal molecule, and I put it into a test tube along with the glycogen and the enzyme that will break down the glycogen. Will glucose be made, right? Yes or no? Then justify your answer. Now, the answer has to do with this diagram. Of course, the answer has to do with cell communication. That's what we're learning about. We want to think about this cell communication process. If I take the signal molecule and I put it into a test tube along with the response molecule, which again is the glycogen phosphorylase, will it do its job? And the answer is no, it will not, because we didn't do this step. And without that step, you can't do these steps. Without those steps, you can't activate the enzyme. The enzyme is in the test tube, but it's just sitting there, along with the glycogen and the epinephrine, because the enzyme here doesn't receive the signal. The enzyme here receives its signal from the one before it. And of course, that's from before that and before that. And if we don't have a receptor and all those other molecules, then we won't get any response, right? And so, again, this is all cell communication pathways have to have all the steps. Very quickly, one other way that multicellular organisms use cell communication is in recognizing pathogens in your immune system. We already know that cells and viruses have these shapes on the outside of them called glycoproteins. They act like an ID badge for your immune system. Your immune system is going to systematically test all of the cells in your body to see if they belong or they don't belong. That job is partially done by these things called B cells. B cells all have different shapes on their outside of them. They're glycoproteins. So in this case, it's not a glycoprotein, it's a protein receptor. They all have different shapes, and they float through your body looking for the shape that matches. Now, if you are not currently being invaded, then there should be no B cells that would match anything inside your body. They should all be inactive. But if the B cell happens to find a cell that has the right shape, the B cell is activated, and the B cell will then start to make these things called antibodies, right? So I know this isn't exactly what you would think of as cell communication, but in a way, there is some communicating being done between the pathogen and the B cell right there, right? Information is being exchanged. Now, the B cell actually can't start to do its job, though, because it needs something called a helper T cell to come along and activate it. The helper T cell also has the shapes around the outside, and if you notice right in this little spot, the B cell and the T cell are talking to each other. The B cell is basically saying, look, I found this shape right there, right? Do you see the little orange triangle in there? That came from the pathogen. So the B cell is saying, look, helper T cell, I found this thing. Is it important? The T cell matches that shape and says, yeah, that's important. And it releases these things called cytokines. You might have heard of this now in the COVID, right? Some people are having a very extreme response to COVID because they are having something called a cytokine storm. Their immune system is just freaking out and pumping tons of these chemicals, and it's activating their entire immune system. And actually, their immune system is hurting them, right? But in this case, it should just activate the B cell, and the B cell can go off to do two things. It's going to make lots of copies of itself. Some of those copies will be called plasma cells, and they will make antibodies. Some of them will just stay, and they'll be called memory B cells. And of course, that's what a vaccine's all about. In a vaccine, you make this part happen first with a harmless shape, and that will get the memory B cells to be created. And then when you encounter the real life virus, the memory B cells can become plasma cells, which will then make antibodies. And the antibodies will go through and collect the pathogens. Antibodies don't actually fight the infection. They surround the infection, or they hold the infection in place, or they connect so that the poisons can't connect to anything else, right? Basically, antibodies neutralize the invaders so that these cells called macrophages can come through and eat all of the invaders that have been immobilized, right? And so a lot of different ways that cell communication is used. Again, maybe you don't think of this as communication, but I do, because it's a lot of information that's being passed between cells. Yeah. Now, single-celled organisms also need to communicate. This is not a single-celled organism. This is the Hawaiian bobtail squid, as you can see. And this guy is famous because he can glow. You can see his eyes are glowing, right? Like, that's pretty cool. This is, for once, not photoshopped fake image off the internet. This little squid, and it is little, it's like a few centimeters long, can glow. But actually, the squid doesn't glow. Inside of the squid's head live a colony of these little bacteria called Vibrio fischeri. You don't need to know that at all. But the bacteria can glow. They have an enzyme called luciferase, which will allow them to create light. But when scientists took the bacteria out of one of these squids, they found that it didn't glow. The single bacteria doesn't glow, but if you let them grow and grow and grow in a test tube, at some point, at a very certain density, here we are, when the population reaches a certain density, a certain number of bacteria around, suddenly they all glow. They all turn on all at once. Now, this is weird. How would a single-celled organism know that it's alone or not? And why would it even need to do this? Well, the why part is a little bit easier to explain, because one single cell glowing isn't going to be very helpful. So if you're that single cell, if you're the first bacteria of the colony, if you start glowing, you're just going to use tons of energy, but you're not going to make very much light, and it's basically pointless, right? It's only when you have enough bacteria around that you can make enough light to be helpful. And so you don't want to glow until that point. Besides these bacteria, let's say you're an E. coli bacteria and you have infected the intestines of some organism. You could start to release your toxins and start to like do your thing, but you on your own can't do much. And all you're going to do is alert the organism's immune system for them to come and kill you, right? So it would be better if you waited until you made billions of copies of yourself. And then all of a sudden, you all started to activate all at once. And this would make the immune system of the organism give it a much harder job to try to take care of all those bacteria rather than just the one bacteria, right? So this idea is called quorum sensing. A quorum is the minimum number of individuals for the group to be official. The word comes from like politics, where like if you have a group that needs to vote, you need to have a certain amount of people from the group present to vote. So you can't like have a meeting and only like 5 people show up and those 5 people vote and the other 100 people don't get to vote because they weren't at the meeting, right? Like that shouldn't work. And so the bacteria are kind of doing that same thing. They don't do their thing. They don't do their response until there's enough of them. Now, how does it work? Signal molecules, of course. We are going to release signal molecules and they're going to diffuse off and spread out in the growth medium wherever they're at. And then there's going to be a receptor. Now, you might think, what if the signal molecule hits the receptor of its own cell? That would make the cell glow, but that won't usually happen because diffusion is going to make things spread out, right? Like diffusion is not going to make things go necessarily back towards the high concentration, right? It's high concentration in here and low concentration out there. So the chances that it will encounter its own molecule is low. But it will start to reproduce, and each of those new bacteria will start to make the signal molecule. So in effect, increasing your population increases the signal. At some point, there will be enough signal that it will be likely to bind to the receptor on all of these, and they will all glow at once, right? And so the quorum is being communicated through the concentration of the signal molecule. And so, of course, just to remind you that there's that this is in all those cells. You have your signal molecule that was released, and then down here is the glowing enzyme luciferase that's going to make the light, and we need to signal it to turn on. Finally, one last example of yeast mating, which you might think like, why do we care about yeast mating? But there are a lot of people who think that yeast invented mating, that yeast are single-celled organisms, but they do mate, and they have a very simple and primitive way of doing this. There are 2 types of cells, the A cell and the unfortunately named alpha cell. Why would they choose 2 types of the same letter? I don't know. Why didn't they just call it A and B? Whoever named these things, I think they just wanted to mess with people. But the A cell and the alpha cell. Now, the A cell secretes the A factor and can receive the alpha factor. The alpha cell sends out the alpha factor and can receive the A factor, right? So the A factor comes out of the A type and is received by the alpha type. The alpha factor comes out of the alpha type and is received by the A type. And if they both receive their signals, then these cells will mate. And in this case, mating means smushing their cells together to make one big cell. And for just one moment, the cell has lots of different copies of the chromosomes, but then it's just going to split again into 2 single-celled organisms, and they would have swapped their DNA, and that, of course, is also known as sex, right? And so this is just another example of single-celled organisms communicating, and I don't think I brought one of those pictures again, but it's all thanks to this right here, right? And so this is going to be our focus for a while, looking at the mechanics of that process. as well as reading more about these examples and some more examples of cell communication. But until then, good luck.